The Elder Scrolls Oblivion is undoubtedly a generational masterpiece. Sure, it was a little rough around the edges when it came to bugs, and yes, many NPCs looked like the result of multiple generations of inbreeding, but damn if this wasn't one of the most beautifully immersive gaming experiences of my life. The seemingly endless opportunities for exploration and adventure in this game just blew my mind in 2006. Everywhere I went, there was something to engage and totally immerse me in this fantastical world. A quest, a system I hadn't discovered before, a dungeon to delve, a snippet of the game's deep and rich lore, or even just a wonderfully wacky conversation with one of Oblivion's famous NPCs. Once this game had its hooks in me, it didn't let go for hundreds of hours. In fact, I even still play it occasionally to this day. But the question is, am I just deeply nostalgic for a game that has provided me with so many fond memories, and perhaps for a simpler time in gaming in general? Or is Oblivion in fact still worth playing today? Well, let's explore that question and find out. And let's start with a very brief bit of background. The Elder Scrolls Oblivion was the fourth entry in the Elder Scrolls series, and it launched back in 2006 to pretty much universal acclaim. It generally received 9 out of 10 or even higher ratings from the majority of critics, which was arguably worth a lot more back then. And even today it has a 95% all-time rating on Steam. Now, for context, that's the same score as Skyrim Special Edition, Oblivion's immensely popular sequel, or at least a version of it. There are so many versions of Skyrim at this point. And as a reference point from outside of the series, it's only 1% less than Baldur's Gate 3. And clearly that game was a phenomenal success and is extremely popular. The game was of course developed by Bethesda and was preceded by The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, which is the game credited by Todd Howard himself as basically having saved the studio from financial collapse, with Morrowind's success creating the stability needed within Bethesda to produce such exceptional 4th and 5th entries into the series with Oblivion and Skyrim. But that's enough of the boring background business stuff. Let's talk about what made Oblivion so special as a game. And let's start our journey where all good journeys start. At the beginning, with those early experiences that either hook you in or send you scrambling for the 2-hour refund window on Steam. Well, in my opinion, Oblivion hooks you in beautifully. Following a brief introductory cinematic with, might I add, some of the most epic music in gaming, you're prompted to create your character. And you're provided with a pretty vast number of customization options, especially for 2006. Arguably too vast, as this system really does give you the opportunity to create some absolute monstrosities. But more on that a bit later when we discuss Oblivion's famous NPCs. As well as designing your character's appearance, you're also given the opportunity to select your race. And while I won't go into massive detail for the purpose of this review, but for our purposes here, the main takeaway is that race is actually important in Oblivion, and it has a genuine impact on your gameplay, especially early on. For example, picking a Redguard or an Orc will make for a much stronger warrior type build than a Khajiit will. And this makes character creation feel like a meaningful RPG feature, rather than just a simple aesthetic decision. And we don't see quite as much of that with modern games. Anyway, once you've created your character, you begin the game in classic Elder Scrolls fashion, as a prisoner. And basically as a complete nobody, which is something I always appreciate in an RPG, as it presents the player with a blank canvas from which they can develop their own story, without a load of predefined backstory. However, despite your status as a nobody, and the great role-playing opportunity that provides, the game does immediately throw you into a super high-stakes plot involving the very survival of Tamriel, which by the way is the world that the Elder Scrolls is set in. Oh, and the Emperor seems to like you. I mean, really like you.
You are the one from my dreams.
But jokes aside, I feel like this strikes an ideal balance between giving your character a blank canvas and engaging you in a compelling and immersive plot during the very first sequence of the game. The game also rather elegantly introduces a side plot during this first sequence, though you don't necessarily know it at the time. And I won't spoil it, but let's just say we'll be seeing this prick again at some point. It's just a very well thought out and engaging introduction to the game in my view, even if it is a little generic fantasy and very much predictable within this series. You also get a sense of just how detailed and interactive this world is going to be before you've even left the cell. More inquisitive players will notice that you can loot pretty much anything in the cell, even the seemingly useless skeleton of the cell's previous unfortunate occupant. Or you can just very disrespectfully fling their remains around the cell. Oh, and the fact that you can even mess around with the chains to make them swing literally blew my mind back in 2006. It might not seem as impressive now, but it was really cool back then. And most importantly, it represents the attention to detail in this game, and how all of those details come together to give the sense of a living and breathing world. Shortly after leaving your cell, you get your first taste of combat, which, unless you try to intervene with the NPC skirmish that happens just after leaving, will be a good old-fashioned RPG-style throwdown with that most feared of adversaries, a rat. Now, combat probably isn't going to rock your world in Oblivion. It's very basic in nature, though I actually find it really satisfying in its own special way. It primarily involves light and heavy attacks, ranged attacks with bows or staves, blocking, casting spells, and using consumables such as potions. It's action combat by definition, but don't expect the fast-paced and engaging action of Elden Ring. This is definitely a slower burn, even allowing you to pause mid-fight to use potions and various other items. But it does present the opportunity to be somewhat tactical, especially at the higher difficulties. Like I said, I find it quite satisfying, especially combining stealth critical strike modifiers with bows, or just trying to create overpowered builds by abusing alchemy and enchanting. But yeah, I've got to be honest, the pace of combat isn't exactly setting the world on fire. On the plus side, you do get to humiliate your enemies by stripping them down to their undergarments, and leaving things looking less like the site of a battle and more like the aftermath of a Roman orgy. Sometimes it's just about the little pleasures in life. But on a more serious note, what I will say about this more old school and simplistic RPG combat is that most of the enjoyment isn't in the action itself, but the preparation. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I'm talking about carefully crafting your build, leveling up the right skills, and hunting down the right weapons, armor, and consumables to really make it shine. In my honest opinion, much of the joy in RPG combat is more attached to the macro experience around the combat than the combat itself. And you actually set the foundations for this in these very early stages of the game. First with your race choice, but then with the selection of your birth sign and class, which come just slightly later in the tutorial process. In very basic terms, your birth sign offers some passive bonuses, and in some cases active abilities, and your class dictates the skills that you're going to specialise in, and we'll go into a bit more detail in that later in the video. But during these early stages of the game, this level of build customization just further compounds that classic RPG feel of a blank slate, and the opportunity to take your character in any direction you please. You could be a heavy armor, great axe wielding fire mage, or a demon conjuring stealth archer. It's really up to you, though obviously some builds work better than others. Now there's just one more early game observation I want to make before we move on to the core experience of Oblivion. And that's the feeling you get when you exit the sewers and set foot into the open world for the first time. You're faced with a vast and, in my opinion, beautiful fantasy realm. And it's at that moment that it dawns on you that you can just go anywhere. Sure, the main quest has been set before you, but it's just one of so many possibilities. You could cross the river in front of you and explore the ruins on the other side. You could head into the city behind you and sign up to fight in the arena. Or you could just walk in a totally random direction and find something else to engage in. And I guarantee you'll find something. Because that's the beauty of Elder Scrolls games. To an extent, the player sets their own path, with Oblivion being no exception. And this takes us into the core experience of the game. The real experience, in my opinion. This is when the well-polished and ultra-structured introduction sequence has played out, and it's time to talk turkey. What's this game actually going to offer me that's going to keep me playing for the next 50 hours or more? Well, let's start by talking more about the look and feel of the game, as I've deliberately not covered it in any detail yet due to the fact that during the opening sequence, you're in a sewer. So yeah, it looks like a sewer. Not a great deal to say about that. But once you exit that sewer, you're treated to a vibrant high fantasy world, with gorgeous biomes, unique and varied cities, and dark and atmospheric dungeons. Though you'll discover that those dungeons are repeated over and over again, unfortunately. But in my opinion, the whole world in Oblivion just has this sense of mysticism, and for me nails the medieval fantasy setting in a way that few games really manage. The presence of Oblivion gates in the game are a really nice touch as well. They give the feeling of constant threat in the world, and add to the sense of a world in conflict, with these fiery portals to demonic realms set at contrast with the serene and peaceful forests around them. Yes, obviously it's dated, it's almost 20 years old, but for the time, I think it's a very beautiful game world. Not quite so elegantly implemented, however, even for the time, are the inhabitants of this world. To the extent that I even made a dedicated video theorising as to how they ended up being so damn ugly. Now, the NPCs from the main quest are relatively normal looking, but once you get to some of the less important characters, you're faced with some truly terrifying potato-esque humanoids with facial expressions that suggest that they have an active interest in harvesting your organs. And that's before you even get to some of the player-created monstrosities. Why are these butter-faced freaks so at odds with the beautiful art style of the world that they inhabit? Well, as I said, I tried to speculate on that in a different video, but the truth is, we just don't know. We have to simply take them as part of the game's charm, and of course use them to aggressively generate memes. Their voice acting doesn't really do them any favours either, and that's not because I think the voice actors did a bad job. I think the voice actors did a fantastic job in Oblivion. But it's more due to the fact that Oblivion works in extremes when it comes to voice acting. You either get superstars like Sean Bean playing Martin Septim, or Patrick Stewart as the Emperor, or you get the same 10 people, and I'll add again for avoidance of doubt, talented people, voicing every single other character in the game. Which of course does get repetitive and breaks your immersion to some extent because characters become less believable and unique when they have exactly the same voice, and in many cases say exactly the same thing. I'm guessing they probably ate up the whole voice acting budget on Sean Bean and Patrick Stewart. Though they are excellent in it and they make the main story very engaging. Speaking of sound, Bethesda certainly didn't cheap out on the music. Oblivion has an absolutely epic main theme in my opinion, and just generally some of the most perfectly conceived music for a fantasy setting that I've experienced in a game. I genuinely get goosebumps thinking about some of those tracks. But of course, a beautiful and atmospheric world is only an empty vessel without a good story, or a good set of stories behind it. So let's talk about that next. Oh, and rest assured I won't spoil the story, which does seem to be a theme of many of these retrospective style game reviews, as genuinely excellent as many of them are. So the main premise of the story at least, is that Tamriel is under invasion by the demonic inhabitants of Oblivion, a hellish parallel plane of existence. Portals to this realm have opened all across the province of Cyrodiil, and you as the player are destined to work with the royal family and the various noble houses to put an end to this incursion. Like I said, it's basic fantasy, but it benefits greatly from the deep lore of the Elder Scrolls series, which really helps the plot and characters to feel properly fleshed out. It offers an established rationale and reasoning for the events, and the different individuals' responses to those events, which allows the story to offer more depth than its relatively short duration and basic plot might suggest. My biggest criticism of the main story is that while it starts strong, ends with an epic confrontation, and has plenty of engaging moments along the way, it also has a fair dose of tedious and repetitive content, mainly tied to closing Oblivion gates. Basically, to complete the main story, you're going to need to close a fair few Oblivion gates. And while it's really cool the first time and offers a whole new, totally different and actually quite terrifying world setting to the game, it's unfortunately just the same thing over and over every single time. You go in, you climb some towers, you kill the same old enemies, and you take the sigil stone at the end to close the gate. The good news here is that many of these gates are optional, and the rest of the main quest is really quite enjoyable in my opinion. However, as with all Elder Scrolls games, the side quests in Oblivion are where the game really shines. Not only because they offer so much choice and variety to the player in terms of setting their own path, but also in some cases they simply tell better stories than the main quest. The single best example of this in my opinion is the Dark Brotherhood. Again, I won't spoil the story, but I will say that the creative nature of the assassination missions, as well as the fantastic plot writing, come together to make the Oblivion Dark Brotherhood one of my favourite RPG quest lines of all time. The cleverly conceived quest objectives and the twists in the story just make the Dark Brotherhood an exemplar for RPG questing experiences in my opinion. The flip side of this is that other guilds in Oblivion don't really meet the high standards set by the Dark Brotherhood. I enjoyed the Fighters Guild and the Thieves Guild, even if they can be a bit repetitive in their activities at times, but the Mages Guild is a bit of a dud in my opinion. That's both in terms of storytelling and the extreme tedium of many of the objectives. On the plus side though, completion of the Mages Guild yields the coolest reward by far, and that is custom spellmaking, which we'll talk about a bit later in the video. Of course, side content isn't just about guilds in Oblivion, far from it. And like I said before, the beauty of Elder Scrolls games is that wherever you go, there's gonna be something for you to engage in. And while the quality of these experiences definitely vary, there are some that are really quite special and unique. The village of Hactor is a great example of just stumbling across some of Oblivion's weirder and wackier, and quite frankly, incredibly engaging side content. This is where you happen upon this isolated village, whose strange inhabitants have closed themselves off from the rest of society and formed cult-like beliefs. and it's just a really bizarre and intriguing place that offers a number of mysteries for the player to uncover. Like I said, it's really unique, it draws you in, and it's just another example of how good Oblivion's side content can be. Of course, we've got to look at both sides of the coin, and a less compelling example would be the random dungeons that you stumble across. I mentioned it earlier, and it's the same principle as with Oblivion gates. Once you've seen a couple of these dungeons, you've basically seen them all, which is actually apparently due to the fact that they were all designed by a single person. I tend to only explore them when they're part of a quest, as for me that mitigates the feeling of repetitiveness by essentially giving me a purpose for being there outside of just clearing them out. But yeah, like I said, side content and exploration can be a bit hit or miss, and random dungeons are a bit of a miss. Anyway, let's change gear and talk about character progression next, as that is of course pretty core to the RPG experience. Well, I think it's fair to say that character progression in Oblivion is something of an acquired taste. While on the surface it looks to offer a nice level of RPG depth, without going to the extreme complexities of older titles, it's somewhat clunky in its execution. Basically, everything is governed by major and minor skills. At the beginning of the game you select 7 major skills and all other skills will become minor skills. The cool thing about this is that you get to use and progress every single skill in the game, of which there are 21. Which allows you to come up with all kinds of weird and wonderful combinations. You could be an unarmed specialist who just happens to have a talent for slinging fireballs, or a heavily armoured knight who for some reason insists on fighting with conjuration magic and wielding a stave. The system does make for truly varied build options in that regard. The downside is that it comes with a pretty unintuitive and clunky levelling system. Like I said, you can progress all skills major or minor, however only progressing major skills will cause your character to level. It doesn't really sound like a problem at this point, but when you level you get attribute bonuses, and those attribute bonuses are driven by the major and minor skills that you progressed during the previous level, which means if you want to be optimal and get the best attribute bonuses for your class, then you've got to play in a really weird and unnatural way. It gets fairly complex and I'm not going to bore you with it here, but I do have another video that explains it. It's called 25 Tips for Total Beginners and I'll link it in the description down below. But yeah, my main point here is that it's definitely an acquired taste. And to be honest, I fully understand why they simplified things for Skyrim, at least for the mainstream audience. There are of course other ways to progress your character outside of skills and just generally leveling up, and these include learning new spells as well as acquiring new weapons and armour, with Oblivion having a pretty extensive offering in each of these areas. And the nice thing about going after these upgrades is that they give you plenty of reason to explore new areas, as well as a reason to accumulate wealth and to interact with the game's many merchants in search of the optimal spells and equipment for your desired build. Any character can equip any item and learn any spell, and again this just makes building your character very flexible and leans heavily into that classic RPG build whatever the hell you want feeling. And that actually leads me nicely into a discussion around the next core system that I want to cover, combat. Because all of this character progression really only serves a single purpose: optimizing your character to crush Daedra skulls, and Minotaur skulls, and innocent critter skulls. Just general skull crushing really. Now we already talked about the basics of combat, and basic is definitely a good description. And we also talked a lot about the all-important preparation that goes into making this more basic RPG combat so satisfying. But there are still a couple more important things worth covering. Firstly, not all combat is born equal in Oblivion, and in my opinion, some forms of combat are far more engaging and satisfying than others. And for me, it's the alternative, more unusual forms of combat that really shine in Oblivion, and in all Elder Scrolls games to be honest. This might be abusing the crit modifier to one-shot powerful enemies from range, using special spells and items to cause chaos by making enemies turn on each other, or just turning a lumbering ogre into a rat and then bonking him with your sword. These more creative approaches to combat are what makes Oblivion fights so fun in my opinion, whereas the basic melee combat in the game just feels dated, repetitive and quite frankly boring. The other thing worth mentioning is enemy variety, which isn't terrible in Oblivion. You have your variations of Daedra, goblins, bandits, undead and a variety of other mythical creatures, and the existence of various resistances does make for some variation in fights, but overall the tactics and movesets of the enemies are pretty limited, and challenge mostly comes from cranking up the hit points and damage of enemies using the difficulty slider. Like I said, combat's fun in my opinion and you get given the tools to be pretty creative, but don't go expecting anything particularly mechanically challenging. Though if you truly enjoy inflicting pain upon yourself, then you are able to buff the health and damage of enemies to near impossible levels using the aforementioned slider. Speaking of being creative with your approach to combat, another system worth drawing your attention to is spellmaking, which, as I said before, you can unlock by completing the Mages Guild. And this allows you to combine spell effects to produce some ludicrously overpowered custom spells, and is just generally incredibly fun to mess around with. And funnily enough, I didn't even realise it existed for years after the game launched, just due to the fact that I didn't do the Mages Guild in any of my early playthroughs. And that takes me back to a point I made earlier. There's just so much content and depth to that content that you can spend 50 to 100 hours in this game and not see half of what the game has to offer. You can become a vampire as well, for example, and that has a whole new range of advantages and disadvantages for your gameplay. It even impacts how NPCs engage with you. And again, I think that's another one that I totally missed in my earlier playthroughs of the game. Now, speaking of NPCs, that leads me into the various AI systems that make probably the biggest contribution to the sense that you're inhabiting a living and breathing world. There's something called the Radiant AI system in Oblivion, and it totally blew my mind when I first experienced it. It gives NPCs daily routines where they travel to certain locations, complete various activities, and even stop for randomly generated chats of other NPCs. It actually sounds laughably basic now, but back then it was quite something. Of course it's buggy as shit as well, but it's an Elder Scrolls game after all. There's also a disposition system in the game through which your deeds will influence your standing with literally every single NPC in the world. Raising your disposition might get you discounts at stores, or even give you access to a totally new bit of content like the ability to purchase a player house. Whereas if you let your disposition with an NPC fall too low, they may even attack you. There's even a mini game known as the Persuasion Wheel that you can use to help improve your standing with different NPCs. It's basic and honestly a bit pointless after a while, but what I really like is the whole concept of disposition and how it's executed in Oblivion just adds a feeling of real consequence to the game by establishing a relationship between the player and every other inhabitant of this world. There's also the law system that Elder Scrolls games again have been pretty famous for, in which any crimes you commit against other citizens will land you in jail, unless of course your disposition with the guards enables an alternative arrangement. Wait, that sounds really messed up. To be clear, I mean a bribe. But it kind of makes it a system within a system. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that there are just so many layers to the game that it's no wonder people have spent hundreds or even thousands of hours in it. Speaking of which, and I promise you this is the final topic at this point, you have the game's DLC, which is variable in its quality to say the least. You have quite possibly the best DLC Bethesda ever made with the Shivering Isles expansion that sends you on this bizarre and brilliant adventure into the realm of the Daedric Prince Sheogorath. And then on the other end of the spectrum you have the infamous Horse Armor, an early indicator of the absolute scourge of microtransactions that have become so prevalent in gaming. But the good news for people playing this game today is that all of that DLC comes baked into the Game of the Year edition. So you just get a nice chunk of additional content packaged in, some of which is among the best content in the game. So, what's the verdict? Well, it's probably pretty clear from my excruciating fanboying of this game that I think it's worth playing. But even after I take off my rose-tinted glasses, I honestly still see a game with a lot to offer, especially for fans of more old-style RPGs. In my opinion, the world is still attractive and immersive, the systems allow you that satisfying build-your-own-class experience that is just becoming increasingly rare in modern games, player actions have real consequences, and there are some really creative and compelling quests and storylines to engage in. And of course it features the sexiest looking NPCs of any RPG in history. So yeah, I stand by my recommendation. If you haven't tried it, go and try it. I think it'll be worth your while. So anyway, you've got my opinion on Oblivion, but more importantly, I want to hear yours. So love it or hate it, let me know in the comments down below. And if you're interested in more RPG reviews like this one, then consider subscribing to my channel and hitting the bell notification. The next games on my list are Skyrim, Dragon Age Origins, and I'm also thinking maybe The Witcher 3. Either way, thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.